Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello and welcome once again to me, Phil Craig at the Australian Bar, and I am very excited. Why are you excited, Phil? I have my first book review. Yes, I have two, in fact, and I'm going to read them to you. Yes, actually, no, I should introduce the programme first. World War II again, but a very different angle, actually. And I think you'll find the angle and my guest really interesting. I certainly enjoyed meeting him. That's Tim, and we're going to be talking about the relationship between Britain and France in the Second World War, the alliance that begins the war in great friendship and confidence. And it all goes horribly wrong. And there's a secret, very little known series of military encounters, battles, campaigns between the British and the French, which get sucked into the whole diplomatic dance of all the competing and overlapping alliances that characterize the Second World War. And that's what Tim Bouverie's book is about. And he's a really very learned and successful writer, a bit of a rising star, I think, in that world. So I'm lucky to get Tim. And yeah, that is coming up soon. But first, let me tell you about my book reviews. Please indulge me. Go on. They're only short, but this is a lovely one. Daily Express, quite a big paper in Britain, and the Daily Mirror. I think they're sort of sister papers, politically very different, but I think they have the same owner. Anyway, this thought-provoking account of the final months of the Second World War, it's my book they're talking about, guys. And what happened next reminds us that, while Britain stood alone in 1940, its empire contained a quarter of the world's population, and victory brought consequences. Indeed it did. Focusing on the war in Asia, Craig, that's me, reveals how expectations of the 2.5 million men who made the Indian Army, the largest volunteer military force in history, helped ensure Indian independence. Now we get to the really good bit. Dramatic human stories written in the engaging style of Craig's best-selling Finest Hour, combined with surprising revelations, a glorious cast of characters, and a keen eye for detail to make this a must-read. Come on, guys. That's not bad, is it? I mean, I couldn't have written that myself better. And he kind of really gets what I'm trying to do. In fact, another review. Now, this is from Mark Beesing, the reviews for The Spectator, but I don't know if they're going to print it. But he put it online anyway. So I think I can still call it a review. I can certainly share it. I hadn't read Phil's other books, so I didn't know what to expect. Yeah, I don't know Mark, really, except through Twitter. What I found is a master storyteller at his prime, at my prime. Of course I am. And a book I genuinely couldn't put down. 1945, The Reckoning, says Mark, is an epic story that ranges across the globe from Britain to Berlin to Vietnam, Indochina and India. And he expertly tells the stories of these places through the experiences of those caught up in the conflict on all sides. He skillfully avoids nostalgia, tells uncomfortable truths, and yet ends up with a balanced account of what the end of the war meant for the colonizer and the colonized. I highly recommend it. Oh my goodness, this has made my morning. Yeah, avoiding nostalgia and telling uncomfortable truths without turning it into a kind of anti-imperial rant. That is very much what I was trying to do. So thank you for getting it, Mark. Appreciate that. Talking of comments, we had some nice comments for the last week's show with the lovely Paul French and his expert pronunciation of Chinese words. Yeah, if you've not seen Paul, a lot of you watched him talking about Wallace Simpson a few months ago. Rather fewer of you watched him talking about Hong Kong. Maybe there's a lesson for me there. But I love the conversation. And I think that part of the world, and of course it's all wrapped up in the story of empire, which is a bit of an obsession of mine, you may have noticed. Some commentators we don't see very often. Actually, Wendy Pierce, we've seen before. Hi, Wendy. A great interview. Paul has done his research and very informative. I never knew about these Chinese wars at my school. MagsFab89 was born and brought up in Hong Kong and is bilingual. I wonder if you appreciated Paul's pronunciation, Mags. It seemed pretty good to me. Yeah, bilingual, and I learnt my Chinese history. But Paul is fantastic. And his account of Hong Kong brings back all my knowledge from learning Chinese history and experience. Really interesting. Yeah, and a few more, lots more comments as ever. I'd just like to mention people. I don't think I mentioned you before. Toad Hall, 1973. Yeah, Toad Hall talking about the grooming gangs and the worst scandal. I did have a little rant about that. No rant this week, though. But yeah, if you're interested in my views about that, that's at the beginning of last week's show. Toad Hole obviously agreed with me that it is really scandalous the way that was handled and is still being handled. People just don't really want to engage with what actually happened and have any accountability, which I guess is a theme for many of the scandals we've covered on this podcast over the years. This is nearly 3 years now, 2.5. Anyway, yes, back to World War II. My book's been published in, was it 5 days now? In fact, when I next appear, it will be out and available. And to remind you, it's called 1945 The Reckoning. It's on sale in Australia, New Zealand, India, and the UK. I think if you're American or in any other country, or Canadian, you can probably get the ebook quite easily. If you want the hard copy, you probably have to buy it from the foreign site and pay the postage. Or there's a very good Audible version coming out as well. I am hoping it'll get published in America at some point, but you never know. Depends how well it does, I suppose. Okay, that's it. Enough of me. We'll go and talk to Tim. Like I say, he's only given me about half an hour because he's very much in demand. And I decided rather than talk about his whole book, which is about all of the alliances of the Second World War and the personal interactions, I'd just look at that part of it that's very little explored, Britain and France. Frenemies, frenemies for a long, long time, and never more so than during the Second World War. I really hope you enjoy talking to Tim, or rather listening to him, because I was the one that enjoyed doing the talking with him. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye. Tim, welcome to the Scandal Mongers podcast, and to me at my Australian bar. You're very welcome. And thank you for your really, really cool book, which I'm thoroughly devouring. We were going to talk about all of it, but I got so excited by the first quarter, or maybe third, that's all I want to talk to you about today. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Thanks for having me, Phil.
No, well, look, you say, I think early on, that alliances are essential to win the war. I would not disagree, even if they're flawed, compromised, and untrusting. And I guess of all of those, maybe the perfect example is the Anglo-French alliance, which turns into a kind of undeclared Anglo-French war. And that's, to me, quite a fresh and interesting part of your book. So where should we start? Do we start with the sentimental Churchill and his love of France and his faith in the French, even when things start to go wrong?
Yeah, we could start there. I mean, we could start even before that by saying that there isn't as much natural affinity between the British and the French at the beginning part of the Second World War, and indeed in the 20s and 30s, as one would hope and one would expect. Many British politicians and French politicians and British soldiers and French soldiers had bad memories of their collaboration between 1914 to 1918. That said, the defeat of France was overwhelmingly a military defeat, and it can be ascribed to military rather than political or social causes. And this is the turning point of the 20th century, 1940. It is a completely unexpected event. The French army had held the Germans for 4 years, along with the British, between 1914 and 1918. And suddenly, the second largest army in Europe, a more mechanized army indeed than the Wehrmacht, collapses in 6 weeks. And it is from that event that all the subsequent alliances and machinations, which I describe in my book, stem, because it is because of that that the British have to go out in search of new allies across the Atlantic, and eventually also with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. But you're right to bring up Churchill. I mean, Churchill is one of the few Englishmen who is deeply emotionally attached to France, a country he had visited almost every year since his childhood. He really believes that France represents European civilization, and he's appalled to see the tragedy unfolding of May-June 1940. And this does lead him to make a number of military choices which cannot really be defended on strategic grounds.
No, very interesting. I think that, yes, he's a sentimental francophile. He's obviously kind of obsessed with the story of 1914-18. And you're right that the sudden collapse of the French army was such a shock all around the world, utterly unexpected. And we sort of feel, I think, in the way that the story is told in British pub wisdom, that the whole business with Britain and France sort of ends with Dunkirk. It goes fall of France, Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, and the war carries on. But so much happens after Dunkirk. trying to stitch together the alliance, hold it together, the growing defeatism in France. And then, of course, we come to the moment of kind of betrayal, if you're a certain kind of Frenchman, when Britain and France actually end up sort of going to war against each other. Do you think all of that was inevitable, or could it have been avoided?
No, I don't think it's inevitable at all. I think it could very easily have been avoided. I'm not saying necessarily that even the fall of France could have been avoided had certain military decisions been made differently. And the dispositions of the French army before the onslaught on the 10th of May, 1940. The real tragedy, or the most emblematic tragedy of the Anglo-French alliance is the sinking of a large part of the French fleet at Mers el Kabir off the coast of North Africa by the Royal Navy on the 3rd of July, 1940. That was an absolutely tragic episode, and yet it is absolutely crucial to Britain's survival and to the perception of Britain and Britain's determination to continue the war in other parts of the world. That did not have to happen. The British gave the French Admiral Gensoul, four alternatives. He could take his ships and join the Royal Navy and continue to fight the enemy which had conquered France and was holding the French nation hostage, i.e. the Germans. He could sail his ships to a French part of the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere in the Caribbean. He could intern his ships in British or American ports, or he could scuttle his ships. The only alternative to all of these courses that were offered to Gensoul was for the British to force him to scuttle them, i.e. to sink them themselves, to put them out of action themselves. And it was Gensoul's refusal to take any of these entirely reasonable and honourable options that led to over 3,000 French sailors being sent to a watery grave.
Yeah, I think I did a back of the envelope calculation because I made a documentary about this event, the attack on the French fleet. And like you, I consider it really, really important and so much underplayed by most mainstream historians. So this is why I'm really pleased that you put a lot of emphasis on it. So I did a calculation. I think in those 10 minutes, the British killed more French sailors, their former allies, than they'd killed German sailors in the war up to that point. I think
that's probably true. I don't have the figures to hand. As much as the British had killed any Germans, it had been at sea up to that point. The only place where the phony war wasn't phony before 10th of May 1940 was at sea, but that didn't necessarily result in German deaths.
Not on that scale. Not on that scale. I mean, they do lose.
Not on that scale. No,
they lose a lot. The Germans lose a lot in Norway, and various submarines get sunk, but not on that scale. It's a profoundly shocking and important event. In the lead up to it, though, there are all these incredible meetings, and Churchill's flying to France, trying to kind of persuade them to keep on fighting. Even one remarkable moment, offering to kind of make a political union between Britain and France. And you describe in very colourful terms some of these kind of rather grubby old chateaux where they kind of meet for these rather desperate conversations, where everybody's kind of like saying, "We'll do this, we'll do that," and then they'll go in the garden and they say, "What? It's a nightmare." They're obviously going to give up. This goes on for several weeks. It's all rather poignant, isn't it, and rather sad.
It's tragic, and it doesn't lessen the tragedy that there are moments of black comedy that accompany the tragedy. This is totally different to any sort of war that's ever happened before because the leaders are able to fly around and see each other. And that's something we see later on in the book with Roosevelt and Churchill, and with Stalin and Churchill, and with Roosevelt, Stalin and Churchill. But during the Battle of France, Churchill considers it his duty to bolster the French, to try and keep the French in the war. And this is an understandable point of view and an understandable mission. Every day that the French army continues to fight, they are weakening the German war machine, and they are giving Britain more time to prepare for the Battle of Britain, however that battle may unfold. On the other hand, what the French are continually demanding is that if they are going to stay in the war, the British have to commit the whole of their air force to the battle, in particular their fighter force. And this presents an appalling dilemma for the British because most of the British realize within about 2 to 3 weeks of the Battle of France beginning that France is going to surrender, that France is going to be conquered, and they are aware they have to prepare for the Battle of Britain. And therefore, it is a fairly sound strategic principle that you do not reinforce failure. You do not send your last remaining fighter squadrons into the Battle of
I
France.
know Churchill's sitting there drinking champagne and slapping people on the back and saying, "We can still win this." And yeah, several more squadrons will arrive. And the RAF chiefs are saying, "Please don't say that, Winston."
Yeah, no, absolutely. The RAF commander makes it very clear that if Britain continues to send Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons to France at the current rate, there won't be any left in Britain at all. And the cabinet intervenes. I mean, Britain almost goes to the point of sending too many, and Churchill, not only in this sense, allows his sense of chivalry, I think, to blind him to a more pragmatic approach, or stops him from acting as rationally in the British national interests as he should. But he really did love France, and he was absolutely determined that the British should not behave dishonorably in this truly historic moment, which everyone had understood they were experiencing at the time.
Some of the conversations you quote, though, they're very prescient. Actually, Churchill says, "We will fight on. They won't beat us, and we will come and save you, and we'll bring the Americans to help." And at the time, the French people are saying, "What are you on about?"
Yeah, the French say that Britain will be invaded, and as General Vigan says, Britain will have its neck wrung like a chicken by Hitler within a month. And this is certainly the view of Pétain, certainly the view of the majority of the French commanders. And Churchill, I have to say, was not as confident as this rhetoric implies. He was not as confident as, "I tell you, our policy is victory, victory at all costs, and we will never surrender," etc., etc. I don't think he ever did think that Britain would surrender. But at one of these conferences, when he is preparing to fly back to Britain, General Ismay, his chief military advisor, says to him, "Well, we may have lost the Battle of France, but we are going to win the Battle of Britain." And Churchill turns to him and says, "You and I will be dead in 2 months." So there were serious moments of private doubt that Churchill had, despite his confidence that he showed so bravely, not just to the French leaders, but also to the British people.
Where does this French defeatism come from? Because it seems to be present even from the first week of the battle. As soon as the Germans break through in the Ardennes, everybody's running around saying, "We can't win this. We've lost. Paris is doomed. We're all doomed." And then let's bring in Pétain and get an armistice. This is the country, as you say, that stood up for 4 years against the fathers of these Germans and their grandfathers. Why was this different? Were some of them secretly a little bit sympathetic to Hitler at some level, or were they just couldn't face another generational slog like that?
I think almost none of them were sympathetic to Hitler. There were some extreme right-wingers who admired elements of National Socialism, but they certainly didn't want to be conquered by the Germans. I don't think one can underestimate the trauma of the years 1914. The French are the victors of the First World War, but they feel like losers. It's been fought on their soil. More Frenchmen have died than British or British Commonwealth soldiers. And that legacy hangs extremely heavily on them. Since then, France has been politically divided like nothing before. There is acute political instability. And we all know about the Spanish Civil War, but many people thought that there could be a French Civil War as the country divided between the extreme left, the communists, and the extreme right, fascists, monarchists, and an awful lot of Republicans of varying political stripes in between. During the years that Hitler was in power between 1933 and the outbreak of the Second World War on the 1st of September 1939, there were 11 different French governments and 11 different French prime ministers. A government in France lasted, on average, 4 months. France suffered acutely during the Depression, and there is a great sense of decline, I think, in France. The Germans have a demographic advantage. They have a larger population. It's almost considered a miracle that France did survive in 1914, but that came at extraordinary sacrifice. And I think a lack of social cohesion, and there is a psychological element to this, which is a product, as I say, I think, of the Great War, of the Depression, of the enormous instability of French politics, and of the appeasement policy, which even those who thought it was pragmatic is not likely to bolster a nation's sense of determination to resist at all costs and give you a sense of honor with which to fight.
That's interesting. And of course, the big strategic play, the gambit of the Maginot Line, which was celebrated as the world's most incredible defensive system, the Germans just completely outflank it and neutralize it. And so
Yeah.
what are they going to do now?
There's a tiny bit of a myth about the Maginot Line that the French only expected the Germans to attack the Maginot Line, and that's why they put everything into it. The French did expect the Germans to outflank the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line served a purpose in a way because it forced the Germans to outflank it. And it's not unwelcome to the French that they think they're going to outflank it as they did in 1914-18 by invading Belgium. And if that brings Belgium into the war, that's a not insignificant army, and it allows some of the major battles to be fought, possibly in trenches like 14-18, that's what people assumed, off the sacred soil of France. The great error that the French High Command make, in particular the French Commander-in-Chief, General Maurice Gamelin, is that they believe that the Germans are going to come, the main thrust is going to come through Belgium and Holland. And instead, while the Germans do invade Belgium and Holland, the main thrust comes through the supposedly impenetrable forest of the Ardennes. And it is this crucial breakthrough at Sedan and the fact that there is no French strategic reserve to plug the hole in the line. I mean, one should say, there were major breakthroughs in 1914-18, and the Battle of the Marne being one of the most famous, and then the Ludendorff offensive in the spring of 1918. And it is by the skin of their teeth that the Allies managed to stop the Germans from reaching Paris on both occasions. And we shouldn't say that there weren't moments of absolute panic that occurred in the Great War.
So, defeatism is rampant. They're starting to negotiate the armistice. Everybody becomes obsessed with the fate of the French Navy, which is big, which is powerful, which is modern. And it's not just the British and the French and the Germans who are looking at this Navy. People on the other side of the Atlantic are. Roosevelt is particularly concerned. I mean, he's terrified. He's a Navy man himself. He's terrified that the Germans will end up with the French Navy, the Italian Navy, and the Royal Navy. So he's making all kinds of moves. Churchill's asking him for help, for ships, in fact, for destroyers. It's all politically very difficult. In my view, I think also in yours, all of this comes to a head with this attack on the French fleet. Because Roosevelt's surrounded by people who say, the Brits are going to lose. Oh my God, they're going to be defeatist like the French. And then Churchill does this very, very ruthless thing. Why do you think he does it?
He does it because I think he feels there is no other choice. He cannot. This is not a moment for running risks. Now, how great were the risks? In retrospect, maybe the risks were exaggerated. It would have been hard for the Germans to capture the Force de Raid, that is the section of the French fleet off North Africa at Oran and Mers el Kebir. And the French had given their word and continually repeated this, that they would scuttle the fleet rather than surrender it to the Germans. And this indeed did happen when the Germans tried to seize the fleet at Toulon when they took over the whole of France in November 1942. But Britain was facing the greatest crisis in her history in 1940, the summer of 1940, and there was not the slightest risk that they could afford to take. No risk could be taken. The French were given numerous opportunities to avoid this tragedy. And it could have unfolded differently. At the same time, Churchill wanted to show the world, and in particular the Americans, that Britain was determined to fight on no matter what, and that this ruthless action proved it. And I think one of the more interesting of the new discoveries I made for this book is that the British actually asked Roosevelt's permission to attack the French fleet, and Roosevelt gave it. This
Yeah,
was
you got that quote from the British ambassador when he says, "The thing we discussed, we've just done it."
Yes, the thing which we discussed and you approved. And beforehand, historians have merely speculated about Churchill's motivation for doing this, whereas this is the only bit of documentary evidence which I'm aware of and which is now in the public domain for the first time, which shows that link and shows that it wasn't just that the British wanted the Americans to be impressed by this, they actually asked the Americans about it beforehand.
Yeah, and it does really change the political weather, I think, in Washington. It makes the destroyer deal much more doable because you're sending them to a Britain that's going to survive rather than sending them to a Britain that's going to surrender. Yeah, I looked at your bibliography. You've got 3 books from Warren Kimball in there.
Yes.
Warren was a mate of mine. Warren sat at this table, and I've been to his house. He's very good at all this, and the way that the Canadians have got themselves involved. Is he still going strong? I'm only asking because he used to be a friend.
I think he's still going strong. I mean, he's would be at a good age now, but I don't know him. Lives in America, and he edited the Churchill Roosevelt correspondence absolutely brilliantly, and he wrote a really unsurpassed book on the aspects of Roosevelt's foreign policy called The Juggler, which I highly recommend to anyone.
Well, I think in that correspondence, there's a lot about the Navy. And from the minute he comes into number 10, he's saying, if you don't help us, what's going to happen to the Royal Navy? So it's a funny kind of game that's being played.
Well, yes, and there's a lot of irony in this moment and in this debate. So Churchill the British insist that the French hand over their navy or scuttle their navy or remove their navy. And then Roosevelt, as a price for the destroyers that the British request, the 50 pretty antiquated First World War era destroyers that the British request to help them stave off invasion in 1940 by releasing more modern British ships from the Atlantic to patrol the Channel, Roosevelt says, well, one of the quid pro quos I need for this is I need you to promise me in public that if Britain is invaded, you will send the Royal Navy, the largest navy in the world, across the Atlantic to the safety of Canada or the United States. And Churchill refuses. And some people might say, well, isn't this a bit hypocritical? This is exactly what the British were demanding the French do. But there's a crucial difference. When the British made this demand of the French were capitulating. The French were no longer masters in their own house. Whereas Churchill is vowing to fight on the beaches, on the landing areas, on the towns, in the streets, in the hills. And you can't, on the one hand, say that we're going to fight till all of us lie choking in our own blood, as he once said, and on the other hand, say, but if we do get into trouble, we're going to send our navy and maybe the royal family and the collection at the Royal Gallery and the National Gallery and the Crown Jewels, we're going to send them all, we're going to evacuate. It's sending the wrong message. And that is what Roosevelt failed to understand. Nevertheless, he got his pledge. It's also what Lord Halifax failed to understand when he tried to suggest that Britain should explore peace terms with Hitler after the fall of France.
Yes, all of this drama is happening in parallel, isn't it?
All of this is happening in parallel.
Revolt in the War Cabinet. Yeah,
all of this is happening.
Incredibly dramatic.
It's all happening at the same time, and it's the same problem. You cannot ask the British people to make the ultimate sacrifice, and you cannot sustain the morale necessary to survive an invasion attempt and the undoubted air bombardment that is about to happen if they are also aware that the government is behind its back negotiating with the enemy, which Hitler would have certainly made clear to the world when his terms would have been rejected, which I think even Halifax would have rejected any German terms in 1940.
No, you're absolutely right. I have to say, in parenthesis, I noticed one of your sources when you talk about the attack on the French fleet was a certain Captain Edward Pladel Bouverie.
Yes.
And I can't help but notice your name is the same.
It is. It
You
is.
must be related. There can't be that
It
many of
is.
you.
Captain Edward Pladel was the British naval attaché to Paris at the time of the French surrender, and was responsible for a huge amount of the negotiations about the French fleet, and he was my great uncle.
So it's kind of your family's fault this happened. Let's face it.
No, 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 no. He wasn't. Actually, it might even be my great great uncle. He did a very good job. He wasn't the officer who Captain. His name has gone straight out of my head. He wasn't the officer who negotiated with Gensul at Mers el Kabir. He was negotiating with Admiral.
Oh, that was Holland, wasn't it? I think.
Yes, Captain Holland, Hooky Holland. He was negotiating with Admiral Darlan, who at one stage had been a staunch resistor against the idea of a French surrender, but then became one of the most notorious collaborators in the French government.
Yes, and he gets bumped off by de Gaulle's men in the end, I think. Okay, so not many people know about the attack on the French fleet, but even fewer people know about what happened in Dakar, in Syria and Lebanon. I mean, it's a war that breaks out between effectively Britain, with some help from de Gaulle, and the Vichy regime in France. And you said some of the stories are funny. I mean, do tell the story of Dakar, because it has elements of farce to it.
So Dakar is this port. It's the capital of Senegal now. It's the closest point at which between the American hemisphere and Africa. It's the narrowest point. And Roosevelt certainly had great concerns about Dakar falling into the hands of the Axis. It's a French colony. And the British backed de Gaulle in 1940 simply because no other leading Frenchman crossed the Channel. They have no option but to recognize this man who is the most junior general in the French army and was for only a matter of days a member of the most disastrous government in French history. But nevertheless, they gave him their full backing. And de Gaulle then persuades Churchill that he should rally some part of French West or North Africa. Now, North Africa is not a possibility after Mers el Kabir. The North African French are not going to welcome the allies of the British after the British have sunk that portion of the French fleet. But he persuades the British to land him at Dakar. And this is all based on faulty intelligence. He is led to believe that Dakar is full of Gaullists, people who want to continue the fight, people who are ashamed of the French surrender. In fact, most people in Dakar, including the governor, Pierre Boissin, are determined not to re-enter the fight. They're determined to obey the orders of the Vichy government, and they're determined to collaborate with the enemy if that is what the Vichy government so order. And there's an awful lot of black farce that goes on about this. News of the expedition leaks. The Free French that's taking part in this operation are not remotely discreet about where they're going and what they're going to do. The idea behind the operation is for the British fleet, which transports the Free French troops, to arrive one morning off the coast of Dakar and be so impressive on the horizon that Dakar just surrenders. They say, "Well, we're not going to fight, and we will just hand over the keys to the city to General de Gaulle." Unfortunately, when the fleet arrives, there is the thickest possible mist, and which renders this grand spectacle completely invisible. People fly into Dakar from the aircraft carrier and try and negotiate. They're taken prisoner. Then de Gaulle's emissaries go ashore and try and negotiate. They're fired upon. It ends up being a complete fiasco and a full-on shooting war, resulting in an awful lot of damage to Royal Navy vessels, several deaths, and a distinct sense among the British that de Gaulle is finished. This has been an utter humiliation for him. The British aren't going to put more resources behind this man who clearly can't command the loyalty of Frenchmen who would rather fight against the enemies of the Germans and collaborate with the Germans than side with him. And as de Gaulle himself later admitted, he contemplated suicide after the Dakar fiasco.
Really? Gosh. And then there's Lebanon and Syria, which is a much bigger fight and many, many more casualties. And long story short, the British, with a lot of Australians, kind of beat the Vichy French in that area. And there are lots of prisoners, and I think almost all of them refused. I think de Gaulle sends an emissary, and they say, "Come and join us, fight for the honour of France." And they all say, "No, we want to go back to Vichy." And I think that's what happened.
That is exactly what happened. The British intervened against the Vichy French in the Levant, in Syria and Lebanon, that part of the Middle East which had been given to France by the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the First World War, because the government of Iraq, which is quasi-autonomous but nevertheless a part of the British Empire to a certain extent, revolts against British military presence in Iraq and tries to use the Germans and the Italians to help drive out the British from Iraq. And in this 1 month war in May 1941, which I think very few people are aware of, but I give a whole chapter over to in my book, because I think it is the theme of my book is Allied infighting, and that includes Allied military infighting. The German Air Force uses French air bases in Syria and Lebanon to attack the British in Iraq. And this brings home to the British the strategic danger of having the Levant in Vichy hands. And they decide, again, slightly persuaded by General de Gaulle and his deputy, General Catroux, that they must go in and remove Vichy. The soldiers that take part in it, including, as you say, a large number of Australians, are told that the Vichy forces will surrender immediately, that they will be welcomed as liberators. The Australians are told to wear their felt hats, not their helmets, as a sign of friendly intent. But the Vichy French fight like absolute tigers in the Levant. And they make it clear, those that are captured, that one of the reasons they fight so hard is because they are so eaten up with guilt and shame at the dishonor of the French surrender on the mainland, and they want to show the British that they are not yellow. And at the same time, they blame the British for, and they certainly blame the British, and they consider the Gaullists traitors. They blame the British for Mers el Kabir. They blame the British for Dunkirk. They blame the British for their own military collapse in 1940, and they considered the Gaullists traitors to the.
Well, there is a lot of this. I mean, I think you also said you have a story that really surprised me. A lot of French soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk alongside the British, and I think you say almost all of them decided to go back.
Yeah.
So,
but they thought the war was lost. De Gaulle was not known. They wanted to be with their families. They thought, why are we going to continue to fight? We're not even fighting for our own country anymore. But it's a rather tragic moment, considering how much risk and how much death resulted from the evacuation of French forces from Dunkirk, that the Royal Navy ran this risk and suffered the consequences. And then all of these French soldiers and sailors, well, the vast, vast majority of them, chose to be repatriated.
Yeah, I once interviewed a sailor who had been on HMS Keith, one of the destroyers, sunk at Dunkirk. And he had a few choice words to say about the risking lives for the French.
Mm.
But yeah, that's, I guess, what happened to this alliance. It kind of collapses in acrimony, and yet it's restitched, isn't it, at the end of the war? Of course, de Gaulle does survive. He doesn't shoot himself. He becomes a massively important figure. I think Roosevelt and Churchill always have kind of mixed feelings, but he emerges as a very strong figure, and Britain and France are friends again at the end. I mean, that's maybe a terrible oversimplification, but they are.
Yeah, no, well, the British are always absolutely determined, and Churchill is consistent in this, that France should be rebuilt as a major power. They know that Britain has been weakened greatly by the war, and Roosevelt has made it very clear that American forces are going to be withdrawn from Europe 2 years after the end of hostilities. In the end, they end up staying, but or a large portion of them end up staying, but that's not foreseen in 1945. And so the British need France to be built up as a great power again, because Britain is not strong enough to hold the balance of power in Europe against either a potentially resurgent Germany or, even more alarming, the new Soviet threat.
So interesting. And just to take you into areas you haven't written about, so you may not want to talk about, but I'm about to publish a book, which I may have mentioned 100 times on here, which includes a story of what happened in French Indochina in 1945,
Yes.
where I think partly as a consequence of de Gaulle and Churchill wanting to bulk up French power and prestige, an army is sent, British Indian, with a French force led by Leclerc, the man who liberated Paris, apparently. And they fight this nasty little war in Vietnam, in what becomes Vietnam, against Ho Chi Minh, who considered himself up to that point an ally of the Americans.
Yes.
And that sets that region up for quite a lot of pain. I mean, is that a fair précis of what happens?
Yes, no, I think it is. That the French wanted to reclaim their empire, and the British were supportive of the French reclaiming their empire because, A, the British were imperialists and believed in empire. But secondly, if the French empire was taken away from them, particularly Indochina, which Roosevelt wanted to do. Roosevelt had a loathing for all empires, but was particularly vitriolic about the French empire. And in that context, particularly vitriolic about the French rule in Indochina. The British realized that if they allowed the Americans to have their way and dismantle the French empire, they were going to be next. The French empire is the first line of defense against American assaults on the British empire. So the British are determined to help de Gaulle reclaim Indochina. Indochina, which, by the way, the Vichy government had effectively surrendered in 1940 and in 1941 to the Japanese. So the Vichy government wasn't simply collaborating with the Germans. They also collaborated in the Far East, or capitulated in the Far East to the Japanese. But it's very, very odd. You think about alliances and how everything works out, and it all depends at that particular time of what is the greatest threat, who is the greatest enemy, and my enemy's enemy is my friend. That would go for Ho Chi Minh, as you were just mentioning, and the ironies of him being an ally of the Americans. Another example or parallel would be Finland, which in 1940 is invaded by the Soviet Union, a completely unprovoked,
bravely resists,
utterly cynical invasion, bravely resists, inspires the world, shames the British and the French to at least consider sending an expeditionary force, even though they don't, because they prevaricate until it's too late. The Soviets, having been utterly humiliated in Finland, nevertheless, by sheer force of numbers, prevail. And then when Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Finns think, right, well, this is our opportunity to liberate the full Finnish peninsula and archipelago. So they take up arms again as a quasi-ally of the Germans. And then, because Britain has now become an ally of the Soviet Union, Britain is forced to declare war on Finland by Stalin. Stalin insists, if you're going to be my ally, I want you to declare war on Finland. And Churchill resists. Churchill says this won't be understood by the British people. It won't be understood by the American people. We are friends with Finland. We admire Finland. It's obviously unfortunate that the Finns are now fighting the Red Army, but I mean, he doesn't say this explicitly, but this is your fault for invading Finland in the first place. So the tangled alliances and the tangled loyalties are really the theme of my book and what I set out to explore.
Well, I would recommend this book to anyone. And there's so much more in it to explore. We haven't actually really got to the main event, so I hope
we also haven't mentioned the title of it. We might mention the title of it.
Please do. Well, I'll say it in my introduction, but please do tell me what it's called and where people can get it.
It's called Allies at War: The Politics of Defeating Hitler. And as I hope Phil can corroborate, one of the elements of it, which I really sought to bring out from the very beginning of working on this, which would differentiate it from existing literature, is, as we've been discussing in this podcast, it is not just about Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, the United States, the British Empire, the Soviet Union. It includes the Anglo-French alliance. It includes Vichy. It includes Franco-Spain, neutral Ireland, Turkey. It includes relations with nationalist China and British imperial policy in India. It includes the gallantry of Australians in Greece and North Africa. One thing it doesn't include, simply because it would have just been too long, and this has to be a separate book, are the arguments between members of the British Commonwealth, which were many, particularly, I'm afraid, between the Australian government and Churchill. But those arguments tended to be mainly military rather than political, about the use of Australian troops in North Africa when the Australian government understandably felt that Australia was under threat of Japanese invasion.
Well, if I can persuade you to come back in a few weeks, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Stalin and all the other fun stuff. But for now, thank you so much for this journey into this weird world of the Anglo-French War that nobody but us knows about.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very nice to talk to you. Take care. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed Tim. I certainly did. I think I learned a lot, actually, and I can't wait to get him back to talk more about his book and his ideas on the big characters, the big beasts of the Second World War. Not a great deal more to say this week. Got a bit overexcited and hyperventilating earlier about my reviews. Maybe I'll have some more. I don't know. I think The Australian is doing one. I actually think sometimes I have better contacts in Australia than I do in London. But anyway, I think they are, and that's quite a big paper. Down Under, and I think some of their reviews might be picked up by other papers in other countries too. Anyway, I live in hope. I've heard lots of men going on about war, haven't we, on the podcast recently, and a few women, but mostly blokes. So been looking to do something a bit different, and I'm really excited to say I've got a bit of a star coming on, maybe not for a couple of weeks, but it's Jill Hornby. I don't know if any of you saw that brilliant adaptation on this the BBC made, but I think it was made with lots of foreign money, very glossy. Miss Austen, it's the story based on Jill's book, which kind of continues the story of Jane Austen's family. And actually, it sounded, when the project was announced, maybe a bit cheesy. Oh my goodness, it's brilliant. So well done. Very moving. We all sat in here watching it. Me, Francis's mum, and they were sobbing away. I may have blinked back a manly tear as well. Very powerful, beautifully written, very much in the spirit of Jane Austen. And yeah, rather different, maybe more female energy than some of the books we've covered and some of the subjects we've covered. But anyway, Jill has written 3 books. Well, 2 have been published, Miss Austen and Godmersham Park, and she has a new one called The Elopement. Yes, we all remember The Elopement from Pride and Prejudice, don't we? But it's sitting upstairs. I have a pre-publication copy, which has been read by half the street. And it's really, really good, actually, if you like that sort of thing. Or if you're just interested in that period. I mean, the social history is beautifully observed. And the characters, you really do believe they are from Jane Austen's world. Because, of course, they are all based on her family and what happened to them after her death. So, yeah, that's going to be fun. Another rather different subject. I was very pleased to get Nina Studer, or Studer, maybe Studer, I think that's German background. Anyway, she's written this book about the cultural history of drinking, especially the world's most notorious drink and most scandalous, absinthe. Yeah, the green devil, famously loved by various impressionistic painters in Paris during the Belle Epoque era. So that'll be interesting, different, bit of scandalous cultural history about booze, various other subjects and authors and ideas bubbling around. Still really enjoying doing this. I hope you all are enjoying listening and watching. Thanks for your company today, as ever. Please please subscribe if you haven't already. I know quite a few of you are newish because you came in with that show we did a couple of weeks ago with Mock, which got a bit of an audience bump. If you're sticking around, thank you for your company, and please subscribe on YouTube because it helps, even if you're listening on audio only. That's it from me. Have a great week. I will see you soon, by which time I'll be a published author. So go me. Bit nervous, also excited. See you soon. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.